Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to episode number 3 of the Keller and Heckman Telecom Group webinar series. My name is Casey Lide. I am joined today by my colleagues Greg Kunkle and Wes Wright. And today we're talking about spectrum, and in particular, transition at the FCC, new leadership in Washington, new leadership at the FCC, and we'll talk about some of the policy implications of that. So we'll start off with, I'll start off a couple minutes talking about in the highest level, new leadership and priorities at the FCC. And then we'll dig right into the nuts and bolts. Greg's going to talk about the CBRS spectrum and the 3.65 gigahertz band transition. We'll talk about 6 gig expanded use issues, 900 megahertz rebanding, and some issues involving Enterix. And that'll take most of our discussion today. We'll follow that up with some short discussions of various other topics that you see there: T-band, 800 megahertz, 4.9 gig, TV white spaces, and finally FCC enforcement issues. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. Please feel free to enter questions as we go along in the question and answer box. So this is our esteemed new leadership at the FCC, Acting Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel. There's probably a betting market in DC right now as to whether she will be named permanent chair of the FCC. I'm not willing to offer a prediction on that. During the Trump administration and the FCC tenure of Ajit Pai, Ms. Rosenworcel was fairly critical of spectrum policy, national spectrum policy. She opined frequently on the lack of coordination at the federal level, and really had some different priorities than you saw coming from the Trump administration and from then Chairman Pai. At the highest level, this is these 3 points are sort of what we see as new priorities from the FCC going forward. Now, to be fair, some of this is not entirely new. There was already a trend, for example, towards spectrum sharing, but we think that will simply continue. As I mentioned, Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel was critical of the lack of national planning, and we think that that's going to be something that she will try to address going forward. And as you see there, the Commerce Secretary, newly confirmed Gina Raimondo, also places an emphasis on spectrum planning. And as you probably know, NTIA within the Department of Commerce has a significant role in spectrum as well. So to have that be a priority within the Department of Commerce is meaningful also. Again, going forward, probably more of an emphasis on spectrum sharing as opposed to very exclusive licenses. And somewhat related to that, we think there will be a greater amount of spectrum made available for more flexible or unlicensed use as a technical matter and as a policy matter going forward. And we'll see these themes sort of reemerge throughout the discussion today. So with that said, I want to turn it over to Greg. So Greg, tell us about CBRS and what the FCC is doing to make spectrum available to entities other than the major wireless carriers.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. So there's quite a few things, and we're going to go through a number of different spectrum proceedings and items that have been developing the last couple of years and likely continue the next few years. And I agree with your opening statements that you'll see these themes of flexible use and sharing interspersed throughout what we talk about today. The first one I wanted to touch on, because it's been one of the bigger items at the FCC over the last couple of years, is CBRS, or the Citizens Broadband Radio Service. Probably about 2 years ago or so, I gave a presentation when we could actually go to conferences, and I asked the people in the room how many people had heard of CBRS, and there was maybe 100 or so people in the room. And about 5 raised their hands, and maybe they were just shy, I'm not sure, but there's been a lot of discussion about CBRS the last couple of years, and I would bet that if we could visit again, that number would be closer to everybody putting their hands up and have heard of this at some point recently. Those who don't know, this is 150 megahertz of spectrum and just high level from 3550 to 3700 megahertz. And what it does, it mixes licensed and what are effectively unlicensed technologies and federal users, and coordinates sharing of the band between all three of those through a third-party database, the Spectrum Access System, that works to assign frequencies and power limits and coordinate use in near real time. So the primary purpose here of the SAS is to ensure that lower tier devices don't interfere with higher tier operations. So you've got the three tiers: the general authorized access tier, the GAA, the PAL tier, and the incumbent tier. And the incumbents are federal users, earth stations. There's some grandfathered Part 90 3.65 gigahertz users there. PAL licenses are the auction licenses, and the GAA is the equivalent of the unlicensed tier of service. And the SAS coordinates all of that. But the other benefit is that it's really that SAS concept that opened this band up for use. So this was spectrum that was in the federal bucket for a number of years, for a long time, and the FCC had worked with NTIA and the White House to try to free the spectrum up for non-federal use, and they were hamstrung because there were these federal users and coordinating the non-federal use didn't leave much left over. And so the SAS was the solution to that. And the SAS allows devices to get much closer to other systems on the same frequency, co-channel, or it coordinates those uses than they could under a traditional uncoordinated system. And so you have sharing of this band between these three tiers of service. The FCC at this point has certified several SAS providers. I've got them up on the screen: Amdocs, CommScope, Federated Wireless, Google, and Sony as SASs. And this is up and running, as we'll talk about in a few minutes if we go to the next slide. So I've just got up the band plan here, and I just wanted to point out a couple of things about the way this works. Is that you have from 3550 to 3700 megahertz, 150 megahertz of spectrum. You have the incumbent users basically encumber that whole 150 megahertz potentially in any part of the country, right? Though not at any given time. These could be earth stations, which are fairly static, or they could be radar stations on naval vessels that come into port and then leave and aren't there for several months at a time. The general authorized access users also can occupy this whole 150 megahertz of spectrum. And in the lower 100 megahertz, that's where you find the priority licenses. There's 100 megahertz there, but if you notice the note at the bottom, no more than 7 of the 10 megahertz priority licenses will be issued in any county. They're issued on a county basis at any time. So 70 megahertz of the lower 100 megahertz is priority licenses at any time. And the other thing that's different about that is it's not like the traditional way the FCC has licensed spectrum, in that you get a discrete channel block for a specific area. So the PAL license is for a specific area, it's for a county, but it's not for a specific channel block, a discrete channel block. There's no channel block A licensee, channel block B licensee. Again, the SAS is coordinating those frequencies within these parameters. And we go to the next slide. Like I said, priority access licenses, sizes counties, license terms set at 10 years. There is a renewal option for PAL licenses with a substantial service requirement. So there is a requirement to provide service before those licenses will be renewed. That is on a license by license basis. So if you want to keep your licenses, every license is going to have to meet this substantial service requirement. There's certain safe harbors the FCC has adopted for that. There's a 40 megahertz aggregation limit for the PAL licenses, and the FCC does allow partitioning and disaggregation of those licenses. So at some point, we're going to see, I'm sure, a secondary market start to develop for CBRS like we have for other bands. We'll go to the next slide. So the general access tier at this point is fully live, has been for a little over a year. There is what the FCC calls the environmental sensing capability. The ESC and those sensors have been certified by the FCC, and what those do, they sense, when I mention the naval vessels, they sense those vessels coming into port with their operations that might be impacted by lower tier CBRS operations, and they will roll back those operations from the coast to make sure there's not interference to that higher tier of service. For priority licenses, the FCC held its auction starting in June of last year. There were over 20,000 licenses won at that auction. More than 90% of the available licenses. Huge auction. It's the biggest auction that the FCC has ever had in terms of total number of licenses. It raised $4.5 billion. Of that, Verizon accounted for almost $2 billion of that total. So this is a band that the carriers are interested in, but also a band that others are interested in. So you had a number of smaller wireless ISPs participating in this, rural providers, critical infrastructure was a participant in this auction, which is not typical, and invested about $200 million in CBRS spectrum, which is again a big chunk for companies that don't particularly play in the FCC's auction. The first wave of PAL licenses was issued last Friday, March 12th. And what we're doing right now is the SaaS providers are finalizing their channel mapping procedures. So as I mentioned, the PAL licenses are not assigned specific channel blocks. So it presents an issue of, well, if I won a license in County A and I won a PAL license in County B and they're adjacent to each other, how does the SaaS know that I want to be on the same frequency or I don't want to be on the same frequency? Maybe I want to have different frequencies for reuse purposes. And so the SaaS is right now, the PAL winners have elected their choices, sent those to the SaaS providers. Hopefully you've done that if you're a PAL winner. And the SaaSs are evaluating that information, putting together an algorithm to try as best they can to put everybody on the preferred channels within that lower 100 megahertz of spectrum. Next slide. And then the last thing I wanted to say about this is, and we could do a whole hour on CBRS, I'm sure, and there's lots of content out there. This is just the key points and key developments. Is there's a number that this band for about a decade was initially for Part 90 users in the 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz band. And it was one of the few bands that was available for site-based higher speed communications, really the only site-based broadband spectrum that was available at the FCC. And so those users are being sunset out of this band. Those licenses at this point are expiring on a rolling basis. So as your license expires, it will no longer be renewed. You either have to convert to CBRS if you want to stay here in 3 gigahertz, or exit the band, go to 5 gig or some other service, but you're not going to be allowed to stay in 3.65 anymore once your Part 90 license expires. And there's different expiration dates for different licenses. It depends on your license. The FCC has granted a limited number of extension requests. My guess is, since we're getting into this at this point and they're starting to issue the PAL licenses and the GA tier has been live for a year, we're probably not going to be looking at a lot more extension requests granted. And the other thing is to keep in mind about 3.65, there are no new site registrations permitted. So you can't add sites to your 3.65 license anymore. Like I said, the FCC wants to transition out of this band, and that's one of the ways they're pushing licensees out of here. So that's my update on where we are with 3 gigahertz.
Okay, great. Wes, let's talk about C-band for a minute.
Sure. Yeah, and that was great background, Greg. So thanks for that. Before C-band, I kind of want to zoom out a little bit and look at what the FCC has done with what it calls the mid-band spectrum over the past several years, because really the FCC started laying the groundwork for redoing or opening up several allocations a few years back. So, excuse me, in August of 2017, the commission issued a notice of inquiry asking about the current use of several bands within the mid-band spectrum, including 4 gigahertz and the 6 gigahertz bands. The stated goal at the time from the FCC was to allocate some more spectrum for mobile and unlicensed operations to generally support, consumer Wi-Fi broadband type offerings. The 4 gigahertz band is also known as the C band. It is shared historically on a co-primary basis with fixed services and satellite earth station licensees. But as a practical matter, the satellite earth station licensees had gobbled up most of the band and made it nearly impossible for fixed point-to-point operations, even though the rules would have permitted that. So the commission identified 4 gig, the C band, as an area where additional spectrum could be used to support some of these stated consumer-oriented purposes. So the first step the FCC undertook was to require satellite earth station licensees to update technical information on their current operations, so the commission could determine, what portions of the band were actually in use, what portions might be available in certain parts of the country, and things like that. The next step was to auction the C band and then plan to relocate incumbent earth station licensees to a portion of the band that had not been auctioned. So the FCC had started this auction in early December and wrapped up the auction just about a month or so ago. And as the FCC, so, it started with the notice of inquiry where the FCC is investigating what it can do at multiple bands. And then it ends up setting ultimately rules for auctioning this spectrum. And the commission had some competing ideas on how to structure the auction. And several groups had urged the agency to adopt rules similar to what they had adopted for the CBRS auction, smaller channel blocks, licensing smaller geographic areas. And that would level the playing field a little bit for small providers and critical infrastructure companies that use the spectrum for private internal operations and don't otherwise compete with the large carriers. And this made sense to mirror the CBRS auction rules because the C band, if you recall from Greg's channel plan on a prior slide, the C band's adjacent to the CBRS band. Ultimately, the FCC adopted different rules, as you can kind of see on this table, for the C band auction. It settled on larger channel blocks and larger geographic areas. As part of the process, it's a little more complicated with C band because of the incumbents. So the FCC is also has required the auction winners to pay some relocation costs to impacted incumbent earth station licensees. So that's going to increase the investment required from auction winners. And the FCC felt like it needed to recognize that significant additional investment by providing a longer license term. So you can also see that on the table here. And from the FCC's perspective, I think that they would argue that these different rules for this auction worked because the commission raised like $81 billion and more than like 95% of it, some $78 billion, was paid by the 3 national carriers, Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. So the C band was auctioned recently. And as we're going to see on the next slide, the FCC is now setting the stage for an additional 100 megahertz of spectrum that's immediately adjacent and below the CBRS band, so the 3.45 gigahertz band. And actually, hot off the press, the commission just finalized the rules for this auction at its open meeting yesterday. And there was a similar tug of war between some of the smaller carriers, critical infrastructure, and the large carriers about how those rules should look. Smaller carriers, I mean, I'm generalizing here, but tend to favor the CBRS auction rules, smaller geographic areas, smaller channel blocks, and the larger carriers favor more C-band type rules. The FCC largely adopted the C-band framework, but in an accommodation to the smaller carriers, agreed to auction 10 megahertz channel blocks instead of the 20 megahertz channel blocks. And the FCC chairwoman was interviewed by the trade press after that open meeting yesterday. And she said that she believed that the FCC made a meaningful change in shifting from 20 megahertz blocks to 10 megahertz blocks. And she hoped that change would still generate substantial investment in funds from the industry, but also increase the number of successful auction winners above and beyond the number that were able to participate in the C-band auction. So I think that, reading between the lines, they're hoping, or she's hoping at least, that the rule tweak with smaller channels kind of threads the needle and accommodates both sides of that debate. And you'll see on this slide also that there are some unique build out requirements for this spectrum. So instead of having to deal with satellite earth station incumbents, the FCC is having to accommodate some incumbent federal users in this band. And I think the only thing I put these up here because I would just want to also use this as a reminder for companies that are participating either in an auction of spectrum at the FCC, and Greg said that's fairly rare for critical infrastructure to do that, but it applies also if you purchase spectrum on the secondary market from a licensee that actually acquired it from the commission at auction. So these auction licenses tend to have different build out and ongoing operational requirements than traditional site-specific licenses for land mobile or point-to-point microwave systems under Part 90 or Part 101 of the agency's rules. So the FCC wants to ensure that the spectrum does not lie fallow. It requires licensees to put spectrum to use within a certain time frame. And for auction spectrum, as you can see here, that usually is tied to some sort of population benchmark, whether it's covering an area that includes a certain percentage of the population or putting a number of links into service based on the population. That is typically those construction requirements are tied to the population of the area covered, even though some of these companies are not using the spectrum to provide service to those end users.
So Wes, before we move on and talk about 6 gigahertz, if with respect to the C-band auction, if I'm a user who's relying on a satellite earth station that operates in the C-band, how is that going to impact us if the FCC is changing how that all operates?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a good question. So there's a couple of ways it could impact if you're leasing from a provider, leasing capacity from a provider. It probably won't change. I mean, behind the scenes, the provider may make some tweaks based on the FCC's rules, but that shouldn't impact your service. If you're a licensee, at this point, you've probably heard from the C-band clearinghouse about your operations, asking to make sure that your system information is updated with them. If that hasn't happened, feel free to let us know, or you can reach out to them directly. But I know they've been compiling all that information, and we've had a couple of clients that have worked with them to ensure that their ongoing operations are protected.
Great. Okay, keep going. 6 gigahertz.
Thanks. Cool. All right. So we talked about the FCC's mid-band notice of inquiry that was issued back in August of 2017, how that kind of resulted in the C-band auction. Another band that the FCC looked at as part of that NOI process was the 6 gigahertz band. So the 6 gigahertz band is used historically for fixed services, largely to support point-to-point microwave backhaul for public safety, critical infrastructure companies, commercial carriers, and a sliver of the band is also available for over-the-air broadcast. But by and large, it's a workhorse band for all those other industries. And really, it wasn't, when you step back, it wasn't all that surprising that the FCC was taking a hard look at increasing access and utility of this band, because the year before, back in 2016, the commission granted a waiver filed by a company called Higher Ground to deploy its SAT-PAC terminals. These were attached to a smartphone, and they relied on the 6 gigahertz band to provide limited cell service in remote areas. The company at the time had planned to deploy like 50,000 of these units within a couple of years. And it marketed the units to like hikers, campers, backpackers, and folks who would spend significant time in rural areas with poor cell coverage. The market didn't really develop for these units. And I think the company's out of business. I could be wrong about that. But after only deploying a small fraction of these units, it looked like that's about hit the end of the road a couple of years ago. But what I will say is the FCC had really showed its hand at this point. And a year after granting the waiver, it issued the NOI. A year after the NOI, the FCC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that if adopted and finalized, would allow unlicensed devices to operate in the 6 gigahertz band. The proposal was heavily opposed by the groups and licensees that rely on this band for mission critical operations. So these are, again, public safety entities, critical infrastructure companies, and even some commercial carriers. You can see the laundry list of groups opposing the rule change on this slide, but parties that supported the addition of unlicensed operations in the band included some of the major technology companies like Apple, Facebook, HP, Microsoft. These companies provided studies to the commission that purported to demonstrate unlicensed devices being able to coexist with licensed point-to-point links in the band. And the groups that opposed the proposal argued that interference it's inevitable, and the 6 gigahertz band supports such mission critical safety of life transmissions that if the FCC is in fact going down this road, they need to do everything in their power to protect the existing point-to-point operations from harmful interference. So what happened? As we'll see on the next slide, the FCC ultimately approved the rule change and permitted unlicensed devices to operate in the 6 gigahertz band. They didn't completely ignore the lobbying and the arguments from the critical infrastructure public safety crowd, and they aimed to protect incumbent fixed operators in a couple of ways. First, the FCC limited the sub portions of the band that standard power units could operate in, and required these to use an automated frequency control system, an AFC system. And the AFC system uses data that's in the Commission's ULS database to identify frequencies on which unlicensed devices could operate in a given area, depending on which channel or channels might be unused by a fixed licensee in the area. The second thing the Commission did was to allow limited unlicensed indoor use for low power devices across the 6 gigahertz band. Things are moving forward. At the end of last year, I believe Broadcom was the first FCC authorized operator of a 6 gigahertz unlicensed transmitter. And I think we expect more to be approved in the coming months, and even one or more AFC systems to be approved in 2021 at some point. So I think that we will see more and more unlicensed devices in 2022 and beyond. So on the next slide, I want to talk briefly about what this means for licensed incumbent users. One thing that really jumps out to me with the FCC's rules is that I think they look better on paper than they'll work in the real world. And one big problem is that, like I said just a moment ago, the AFC relies on data in ULS, and that may or may not be completely accurate. I would try as we might. And we've raised this concern with the Commission. Relying on defective ULS receiver data, for example, could make a channel appear to be available when in fact it's in use, and that allowing an unlicensed device to operate on that channel could cause crippling interference. And I think that it makes interference inevitable. So it's a matter of when, not if. And I think it's fair to characterize the FCC's response as understanding our concern, but essentially saying, that's too bad. Fix the information in ULS to ensure that data is accurate. There are other kind of variations of this same problem. For instance, temporary fixed sites might not be registered in ULS because they could be authorized under a blanket license, or in many cases, not every case, but most, the FCC's rules allow a 6 gigahertz applicant to begin operating a link once a properly coordinated application has been filed with the FCC and it's pending but has not yet been granted. So these are additional issues that are going to continue popping up as unlicensed devices just become more ubiquitous in the band. So what, if anything, is still being done to fight this? On the next slide, we're going to see that several groups have filed a petition for reconsideration and separately an appeal in court to overturn these rules. And I think even more interesting, the COVID relief bill that was enacted in December of last year included language requiring the FCC to ensure that its plan to move forward in introducing unlicensed 6 gigahertz devices does not result in harmful interference to incumbent users or impact critical infrastructure communication systems. So the law essentially says the FCC has to ensure that any technology used that's intended to mitigate harmful interference to these fixed links is rigorously tested and found to be effective for protecting those incumbent operations. And the commission's actually required to report to Congress, I believe, by the 27th of March, so in just about a week, on its progress in ensuring that rigorous testing has been done and anything else to mitigate potential impact to the 6 gigahertz band. There's also evidence in the record submitted to the commission, filed by an incumbent 6 gigahertz licensee, that conducted tests with some of these unlicensed devices and showed that both the indoor and outdoor devices caused harmful interference to their fixed 6 gig links. So, and they found interference as far as 9 kilometers away. So it's a pretty broad distance. In February, some public safety and critical infrastructure groups sent a letter to the commission urging the agency to pause certifications of commercial 6 gig unlicensed devices until some of that rigorous testing had been done. So there's the fight goes on, but I will also say that the FCC seems relatively unconvinced and undisturbed by all this. They, in that appeals case that we cited on the slide here, that challenges these rules, the court did not stay the rules, meaning that they could become effective. And the FCC filed a brief a month or so ago responding to the legal challenge from various groups that cited that congressional mandate. The FCC cited its congressional mandate to generally find more spectrum for broadband. The FCC's brief also cites the COVID-19 pandemic as increasing consumers' reliance on Wi-Fi for work, school, and home entertainment. So we'll see how this all plays out. I'm going to flip it back over to Greg, who, unlike me, may be able to explain a little bit why there's some good in all of this that can come out of these rule changes.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. So, yeah, I mean, you heard what Wes just described, and you think, well, what's going on here? Why is the FCC so interested in this, given especially the importance of 6 gigahertz to almost everything? I mean, it's utilities and the energy industry and the carriers, and that band backhauls a lot of data for a lot of services. And the reason is, what the FCC is looking at is, if you've heard of Wi-Fi 6, the 6 gigahertz band, what they're doing allows them to adopt what's being called Wi-Fi 6E. So it's basically extension of Wi-Fi 6 into the 6 gigahertz band. So what you have right now with Wi-Fi currently is predominantly 20 megahertz, 40 megahertz channels, a couple of 80 megahertz channels. Wi-Fi 6 has the capability for 160 megahertz bandwidth channels. But the problem is 2.4 gigahertz, you have 70 megahertz of spectrum, 5 gig, you've got a few hundred megahertz, but the channels overlap narrower channels and in already congested bands. In Wi-Fi 6E, in the 6 gigahertz band, you've got 1,200 megahertz of spectrum. So it's a lot more spectrum and a lot more room for 80 megahertz and 160 megahertz channels. And that's the hype around this. That's what the FCC sees. And if you look, in the press and online, you'll see this referred to as the biggest development in wireless networking since the Wi-Fi standard was introduced. Just a lot of hype around it. And that's what the FCC is. That's why they're so intent on moving forward with this. Like Wes said, the FCC, even though these court cases are pending and there's the congressional pressure to make sure they get this right, and the database for the AFC portion of this doesn't exist yet, they have started to certify devices for Wi-Fi 6E for the 6 gigahertz band. So they certified their first one, a low power indoor transmitter from Broadcom, like Wes mentioned, at the end of last year. And there's other devices trickling in. So, expect there's some changes between the administrations. I would expect that this is one that they continue to push going forward.
Okay, great. So let's shift gears here a little bit. And Greg, talk to us about 900 megahertz. What's the FCC doing here to encourage private LTE and other broadband deployments?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. So, this is something that we've heard in a lot of our client bases is large enterprise users, critical infrastructure companies. And for years, the question was, well, how do we get private LTE, private broadband? And there weren't a lot of good options outside of the unlicensed bands and then 3.65, which the FCC is phasing out, unless you went to the secondary markets, where the wider bandwidth spectrum was often cases prohibitively expensive to buy from auction winners. So there was this company, Pacific Data Vision, it's now called Anterix, purchased Sprint's 900 megahertz spectrum, and this is the 896, 901, 935, 940 megahertz band. It's the Part 90 900 megahertz band. So this is not the Part 15, 902 to 928. This is not there's some 900 megahertz MAS licenses. This is not that. This is the Part 90 narrowband, 12.5 kilohertz, traditionally two-way voice, land mobile spectrum. So Pacific Data Vision, PDV, now Anterix purchased Sprint's spectrum when Sprint phased out its IDEN network, and that spectrum was going to lie fallow, and so they purchased it and proposed to the FCC that let's realign the 900 megahertz band. So right now you've got these 12.5 kilohertz narrowband channels, and they're in 10 channel blocks, but those blocks are interleaved with each other, and so it's basically a narrow band. There's nothing else you can do there except fairly narrow band operations. And Anterix said, well, let's realign the band, let's move some of these users around, and we can open up a portion of the band for a 3x3 megahertz service. And they targeted enterprise users as the likely market for that service. 3x3 being too small, the big carriers are probably not going to have any interest in that. But for smaller enterprise users, that's something that may be beneficial. It's for some, some may not be, but for some it may fill a niche need. So May of last year, the FCC issued a report and order, and basically they are moving forward with Anterix's proposal. They've created this subband within 900 megahertz that will be the broadband segment. I'll show the band plan on a little bit later. And they provided primarily for a voluntary market-based approach for realigning this band and clearing the 3x3 megahertz portion for LTE service where an applicant steps forward and requests that type of modification. From our experience, these negotiations are moving pretty quickly. Anterix is, this is their whole business model, right? So even before this order was out, they were already contacting licensees in anticipation of the FCC adopting their proposal. And now that it has been adopted, they've been moving pretty quickly to try to negotiate retunings and spectrum purchases and things like that. Let me go to the next slide. So here's the band plan just real quickly. You can see where the broadband segment fits in. That lower segment will still be the 1.5 megahertz paired, will still be the narrowband users, and there'll be another 500 kilohertz paired segment at the top above the broadband segment. And then you have that 3x3 megahertz segment in the middle for the broadband users. We go to the next slide. So like I said, the FCC anticipates that most of this is going to be through a voluntary market-based approach. The only restriction they've placed on this is that the prospective broadband licensee cannot offer more spectrum than the incumbent currently holds, except where doing so is necessary to achieve equivalent coverage and or capacity. So you can negotiate for retunings, to move to one frequency to another. You can negotiate to sell your licenses. You can negotiate to sell a portion of your license for, for example, some lump sum payment to maybe upgrade facilities, upgrade a network. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be structured. And because it's this purely voluntary market-based approach, at least at this point, it's more streamlined than the 800 megahertz retunings. There's not the line items in these negotiations. Most of them are negotiating a lump sum, and it's pretty straightforward. Anterix, for its part, it has put out a statement it's confident it'll be able to reach voluntary agreements with the great majority of incumbents in counties where it qualifies as the prospective broadband licensee, which is most of the country. If we go on to the next slide. So what if it doesn't work? So the FCC expressed some concern with a holdout problem, right? If you're trying to clear this 3x3 megahertz spectrum and it's a purely market-based approach, what do you do if you get down and there's one licensee with one channel and he's holding up the whole thing and preventing broadband from being rolled out to a whole city because he's just not willing to move? So they said a couple of things. The one thing they said, first of all, I think this goes both ways and as part of the motivation here, is that they said, we're going to adopt this largely voluntary approach, but we're going to revisit this within the next year, and we're going to see how successful the realignment has done and whether we've got to do something else to transition the band or just change the plan entirely. And they threw out some options. It could be auctions. It could be closing the window and filing the broadband applications to motivate the prospective broadband licensees to move it along. Could be lifting the application freeze. Currently, the 900 megahertz narrowband users are frozen, can't apply for new licenses or can't expand their current contours. So it could be to back away from the broadband approach here. So basically, they said, this is voluntary for the most part, but don't wait. And I think you've seen that from Anterix and the companies they've reached out to, or people are moving pretty quickly to try to work this through. The other thing they said is that regardless that they want this to be largely voluntary, there is a process to trigger mandatory relocations, right? So if you get to a point where 90% of the 3x3 broadband portion is clear, it can trigger the broadband licensee can trigger mandatory relocations of the remaining holdouts. They still have to pay reasonable relocation costs, and including providing comparable facilities. But it's a more structured approach at that time, and it's not the approach you have now, where you can negotiate for basically anything you want except for extra capacity. One note: the mandatory process does not apply to what the FCC calls complex systems. So there's some systems in the country that are so large, they have so many integrated sites that the FCC said, we're not going to make those licensees go through this. And in those areas of the country, those licensees, I think it's generally large utilities, can negotiate to retune if they want, but they don't have to. So they've effectively taken them out of this process unless they want to negotiate. Go on to the next slide. Like I mentioned, Anterix is the prospective broadband licensee for most of the country, and the reason for that is that to apply for the broadband license, you have to hold more than 50% of the total amount of licensed 900 megahertz spectrum in the county that you're applying for. That's likely going to be Anterix throughout the U.S. There's only a handful of regions in the U.S. where they're not going to be that licensee, and in those regions, I'm not sure there's another licensee that meets that. It's just that Anterix would have to do extra work to get above that 50%. They have, for their part, announced some initial broadband interest from utilities up until now, and they take a few forms. They've signed a long-term lease. It was reported to be a 30-year lease with utility Ameren in the St. Louis, Southern Illinois area. They entered into a license purchase agreement with SDG&E in Southern California, where Anterix would obtain the spectrum, and then eventually SDG&E would become the licensee. And then they entered into an initial deployment agreement with Xcel Energy in Minnesota and Motorola Solutions, where Motorola is going to integrate some equipment and spectrum and provide some initial deployments on the 900 megahertz LTE system to Xcel. So, just to highlight those, that there's a number of ways that it looks like Anterix is open to discussing this with users. And this is one, like 6 gig and CBRS and most of what we talk about at this point, where there's upsides for some licensees and downsides for others, right? If you don't have 900 megahertz spectrum, this is only a potential tool in the toolbox where there might be this option if you're interested at some point in the future. If you do have 900 megahertz spectrum and you're 900 megahertz incumbent, you're gonna be a little concerned and be real careful to make sure that you're made whole in any negotiations you may be undertaking, and that there's you have the same quiet enjoyment of your system post retuning as you did prior to retuning. And we can go on to the next section.
All right, Wes, take us through the T-band.
Sure. Yeah. So Greg, great job explaining kind of what's going on at 900. As Greg mentioned, we have been working with several incumbent 900 megahertz licensees, some of whom are staying in the 900 megahertz narrowband portion of the band. Others are looking at alternatives, and the alternative may be at 800. It may be in the UHF band. And I wanted to mention the T-band as a new but old opportunity also. A little bit of background is probably helpful here. So more than a decade ago, the FCC was auctioning off the 700 megahertz band. It had originally proposed auctioning off the D block in a public-private partnership format, where a private entity would bid on the spectrum, build out a network, and get a modest discount off that price because it would be shared with public safety, who would have priority access in the event of an emergency. When the FCC starts an auction, it sets a minimum bid that must be met before it will actually sell the spectrum. And the D block did not get a high enough bid to actually be sold. So a few years later, Congress changed the law. It decided to allocate the D block to FirstNet. But as part of the trade-off, the law required public safety to give back the T-band spectrum to be auctioned off. And it didn't make much sense even at the time, and it hasn't become a better idea with time for a few reasons. The T-band is essentially land mobile UHF spectrum that's available to public safety and business industrial licensees in the top 12 or so markets around the country. So think of cities like LA, New York, Dallas, Houston, Chicago. And the spectrum was not available nationwide. So that was one problem. Second, the law as written only required public safety entities to turn in their T-band spectrum to the FCC for auction. So business industrial licensees also used the T-band, and in some areas used it more heavily than public safety users, but the law was silent on whether those business industrial licensees actually had to relinquish their spectrum because they weren't afforded access to the D block like public safety was through FirstNet. So the FCC was trying to figure out what to do. And on the next slide, we see kind of where they went. In July of last year, they issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that was going to set forth the plan for the auction as required by the law, because the commission, I believe, was required to auction this by 2023 unless the law was changed. But this NPRM, it all made clear throughout the process that nobody expected the auction to be successful. The Government Accountability Office was interviewing several T-band licensees, both public safety and business industrial, and came to the same conclusion as everybody else, that there's really no viable alternate spectrum that you can transition these users to. So it was also anticipated that the auction would generate far less revenue than it would cost to relocate the incumbent licensees. So on the next slide, we're going to see that perhaps this was the nudge Congress finally needed to resolve the issue. And in December, Congress passed legislation to preserve the T-band. So the FCC announced it's going to lift the licensing freeze that was implemented several years ago to preserve the status quo of the T-band when they thought they were going to have to auction it. And they're going to begin accepting applications from incumbents in the next week or so. So this is not only a potential alternative for folks looking to vacate the 900 megahertz band as part of a potential negotiation with Anterix, but it's also just another tool kind of in your spectrum toolbox for people on the webinar that may be looking for additional UHF system capacity in the next few months, particularly in major metropolitan areas. So that's a quick debrief on the T-band saga. It's been going on for about a decade. Greg is not one to be outdone, so I'm going to flip it back to him, and he's going to talk about a band that has been in flux for what seems to me like about 4 decades. Greg.
It's been a while. So it's in Wes referring to the 4.9 gigahertz band. This is 4940 to 4990 megahertz, 50 megahertz of spectrum here. It's I don't know how long it's been, but we're up to the 7th further notice of proposed rulemaking at the FCC. Was issued last year, so it's taken a while. What's going on here? This band was allocated under Part 90, 50 megahertz of spectrum for years for public safety, and in 2018. The FCC has been struggling for a while to make greater use of this band, and noted in 2018 that at that time it was only used by about 3.5% of eligible public safety entities. And they said, we don't know what we're going to do with this, but something's going to change. We're going to do something to promote the use of this band. It's 50 megahertz, and there should be something that it's used for. More than what it was anyway. They went back and forth. There was a number of rulemakings, and there were some proposals where it looked like public safety would share with critical infrastructure. FirstNet wanted access to the band. There were some proposals to make it unlicensed. What they finally did in October of last year is they released an order, and they effectively gave the license rights to the states. So there are, like I mentioned, public safety licensees in the band now. And what they did is they said, we're going to give one statewide license to every state. So the state's going to designate some contact within the state, within an agency, and they're going to oversee that license. And the state is going to be responsible for deciding who gets to operate in the 4.9 gigahertz band. So it may be in one state only public safety. It may be in another state, no public safety, and open up to commercial providers or enterprises, critical infrastructure. It's up to the states to decide. We can go to the next slide. They removed the public safety use restriction. So, up till now, like I mentioned, this is public safety band. They said we're going to turn this over to the states to figure out what to do with it, but we're not going to limit it to public safety anymore. So if the states want to use this as a way to generate revenue and lease to commercial providers or others, this is your decision, but you don't have to use it purely for state or local government public safety use anymore. Some states, there are multiple licensees in the state currently. Some states have one licensee, and in those licensees, the states have to determine how they're going to allocate that lessor, who's going to hold the statewide license. In states with one licensee, it's going to be that existing licensee. There's some states with no licensees, and the FCC, the further notice part of what they did in October is determine what to do in those states and how to issue those 4.9 gigahertz licenses to the states. And then there are certain states that they said, hey, we're not going to let you make use of our leasing rules because we don't like your compliance with certain other rules and policies and particularly E911 funding. So that's where this is. This is something that if a entity has a strong interest in using this spectrum, and again, there's 50 megahertz of spectrum here, and has good contacts in your state or an interest in pursuing this, it's potentially available now to any entity, although not through the FCC. So we can go on to the next slide.
Yeah, so Greg, the white spaces, a number of years ago, this was supposed to be a big opportunity for smaller markets in rural areas, but it didn't really take off. But there seems like there's some new interest in there nowadays. Can you bring us up to date?
Yeah, no, that's right, Casey. I was in a meeting with an FCC staff person. It's probably going back almost a decade at this point, and it was the typical, the people in the room talking about how there's spectrum for carriers, but there's no spectrum for enterprise users, smaller users that aren't the big carriers. That there's this big hole in the FCC spectrum policy. And that staff member said, well, you guys are going to like what we're doing with TV white space. There's the broadcast, TV broadcast spectrum, and there's distance separations between the TV stations. And so if I have a station in DC and a station in Philadelphia, I might not have a station between the two of those on that same channel because of the required distance separations. And those are wide bandwidth TV channels, up to 6 megahertz of spectrum that was otherwise just unused. And so the FCC had these rules, and it was kind of the predecessor to CBRS, right? There was a database, and you could look in the database and see what channels were available, and then tune your equipment to those frequencies, and the equipment would have some geolocation capabilities. And it never really took off. It was on the one hand bad timing. The FCC was going through the TV repacking, and there were also some complaints the way the databases worked, and some of the database providers gave up and dropped out, and so it never really went anywhere. But it's always kind of hung out there as an item of interest, because there's so much spectrum that's possibly available, particularly in rural and more remote areas. You would look at those databases, and whereas in DC there may not be much of anything, in a rural area or a more remote area, there might be dozens of TV channels available. So it was really, the potential was always there. October of last year, the FCC took some steps to try to make this, to make more use of this band. And so they increased the EIRP for fixed devices in less congested areas. And I'll mention what that is on the next slide. There was an AGL limit that was pretty restrictive, and they eliminated the AGL limit in favor of a HAT limit. And there's a coordination procedure for TV stations that's in the rules, just to make sure that these increased limits don't create interference. We'll move on to the next slide. There's some other things they did to promote narrowband IoT use, Internet of Things use, and some rules for mobile units to try to encourage mobile use of the band. The less congested areas, I mentioned that's where at least half of the TV channels within a device's particular TV subband are available. So we're talking low VHF, high VHF, and UHF. And so this might be one that, even though this has been around for many years and really hasn't gone anywhere, it could be that these rules, that the FCC has started to peel back some of these restrictive technical rules, that maybe we start to see some interest in this band. There was a new database administrator certified within the last year and a half, I guess. And so we'll see where this goes. There might be some interest growing here. That's all I've got on TV White Space.
Okay, time for the last topic, and it's everybody's favorite topic, which is FCC enforcement. So Wes, do you think the change in administration is going to change the focus of the Enforcement Bureau? What should the people on this call, who are largely public safety and critical infrastructure licensees, what should they be concerned about or focused on from a compliance standpoint in the coming months and years to hopefully avoid FCC Enforcement Bureau action?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know that it'll change a whole lot, but I think what I would say is there are three main areas I think people on this call should focus on from a compliance perspective in the next couple of years, because I think understanding where the FCC is likely to focus will hopefully keep folks out of trouble. And I think the areas are spectrum compliance, transactional due diligence, and tower compliance. We've walked through kind of some spectrum proceedings and how the FCC's clear goal here is to increase spectrum sharing. And so there was a case a year or two ago now where essentially a 3.65 licensee added a fixed site where it was causing interference to a nearby fellow 3.65 licensee, but it hadn't registered the new equipment. And so the licensee that was receiving interference complained to the commission. They dispatched a field officer who determined that the cause was essentially an unlicensed transmitter, and the company got fined $20,000 and had to cease its operations because at this point the commission had already frozen the 3.65 registration process, I believe. So as we see unlicensed devices being introduced in the 6 gigahertz band, as we see the 3.65 transition complete itself, as Greg mentioned, those licenses expire on a rolling basis. So for the next couple of years, there are folks who still will be able to operate under the Part 90 of the rules. But as these transitions occur, if I had a fixed 6 gig system, I would make sure my data in ULS was accurate, because if you experience interference, the FCC investigates and they determine that the interference was was partially your fault because the site-specific information was wrong, they're not going to help you. And in fact, that could be considered an unauthorized operation depending on how far off either the coordinates are or if you had the wrong channel. So that's one on the spectrum side. On the tower side, it gets very nuanced and confusing, and we could spend a whole hour talking about the FCC's historic preservation and environmental protection rules. But they find a tower or a communications provider $18,000 back in November for building two towers without completing the FCC's NEPA process. And the way it worked was the company did everything right. They notified the state historic preservation offices, the local Indian tribes, and a tribe had said they wanted to be on site to monitor construction. So the contractor that this provider used, the provider told them, don't start construction until you've reached out to the tribe. Well, the contractor ignored them, began construction. The provider self-disclosed this violation, got fined $18,000 and had to enter into a compliance plan. Another compliance plan occurred in the transactional setting, and this isn't just mergers and acquisitions, but last July, the commission fined a licensee $127,000 for failing to transfer control of license holding subsidiaries as part of a bankruptcy proceeding. So a bankruptcy proceeding can trigger the FCC's transfer of control requirements, similar to the way a transaction does. If you have questions about that, I know we're running out of time here and I'm hitting this quickly, but happy to discuss any potential shifting enforcement focus to make sure that people on the call here don't get any sort of inquiries from the commission. So I know that was fast, but appreciate your time. I'm going to send it back to Casey.
All right, great. Thanks, Greg and Wes. And I see we have a few questions here, and I don't know that we're going to be able to get to all of them. Please feel free to add to the questions in the question box. We'll try to follow up with you afterward if we aren't able to answer your question today. But before we get to the questions, a couple of shameless plugs. First, if you're interested in this subject and sort of the general telecom policy field, we produce a telecom alert that comes via email every Monday. If you'd like to receive that, please feel free to send any of us an email. Second, the next webinar in our telecom webinar series, episode number 4, is going to be on broadband public-private partnerships. That will be on April 1st at 2 p.m. In a couple of weeks. So please keep your eyes out for that. And now let's take a couple of questions, and we don't have too much time here, but let's see what we can get through. First, I think this is probably for Greg. Have you heard of any new CBRS users using technology other than LTE?
No, I have not. Everything I've heard to this point is LTE. They've got about, I want to say about 100 or so CBSD. That's what the CBRS devices are referred to. They've got about 100 or so of those on the market at this point. I know that CBRS is looked at as being a potential home for 5G services at some point. Everything I've seen so far is LTE. Not to say there's not something else out there, but that's what's come across my desk.
Okay. And the next one is about 6 gigahertz. For 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, will there be a database of Wi-Fi operators with locations of fixed high power sites that can help if incumbents have interference issues? Something to help an incumbent track down a possible offender? Maybe we can think on that one a little bit more and follow up follow up afterward. Okay, let's see here.
Well, I say, Casey, I mean, that's the point of the AFC at 6 gigahertz. That those devices are supposed to tie into a database and be identifiable. And so there's some thinking with at least the higher power 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi 6E devices that, even if the FCC gets it wrong, they can correct it later because they're going to be tied into a database just like CBRS is. I think the bigger problem is the low power devices don't have that AFC capability. And there, if the FCC gets it wrong, you can't put the genie back in the bottle because nobody knows where those are. They're not tied into a database. And so that's, I think, to me, the bigger concern. The FCC doesn't think it's a concern because they believe those devices are so low power and will be located indoors that they don't present an interference risk. But that remains to be seen.
Okay, and let's have the last question. What is the current state of secondary markets for spectrum? Are we still seeing licensees partitioning unused spectrum to other users?
Yeah, I can take that one also. It hasn't changed much. We're still not too, so, going back 10 years ago, at least on the enterprise side, I had very few questions about purchasing spectrum. And then that started to grow probably about 10 years ago. And then within the last couple of years, it started to grow into wider bandwidth spectrum. And we've started to get questions now about spectrum for private LTE and broadband spectrum on the secondary market. And I mentioned the couple of deals that Antrix has entered into. The issue still with those licenses is that the prices are often exorbitant unless you're in just a very remote area where there's no population due to the way that spectrum is valued. So where we see a lot of the action on the secondary markets is still on the narrowband licenses and the wider bandwidth licenses that are not quite wide enough for LTE capability. So the 700 megahertz guard band A block, the AMTS, and other spectrum around 220 megahertz. There's some spectrum at 900 megahertz and some UHF licenses. That's still where we see the bulk of the secondary markets activity at this point. Although the interest is growing in other bands, it just might take a while for the budgets to catch up.
Okay, great. Well, it is a few minutes after 3, folks, and this ends our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention today. Have a great afternoon.